let's talk about relative maxima and minima. So a quick note, extrema is the word that we use when we talk about maxima and minima together as a whole. Maxima and minima is plural, maximum and minimum is singular. And most of y'all have probably done max and mins before, but you probably dealt with absolute extrema, which means there's only one absolute max and min on a graph, and you can include infinity. Here we're talking about relative or local extrema, and you can have multiple ones of these on a single graph. Let's look at a few examples and see if you can come up with your own definition for relative extrema. So in this first red graph, I should have arrows on the endpoints. If you don't see arrows, that's implied to be arrows, unless there's a definite closed dot or open circle. Anyhow, this first red graph only has one relative minimum down here, and there are no relative maxima. In the second black graph, there are two relative maxima and two relative minima. It's really important to note that this endpoint here is not a relative minima, and the arrow on the end here is not a relative maximum. In the last graph, the blue one, there is one relative minimum and no relative maxima. Both the endpoint and the arrow are not a relative max. Okay, so what did you just notice, or what should you have realized? Relative extrema are occurring at the top. They're like the mountain peaks and the valleys that you see. Like if you were looking at a picture of the horizon of a mountain range, the peaks here are the relative maxima, and the very bottom, the valleys, are the relative minima. So a couple of things you should have noticed. They cannot occur at the end of a graph, because at the end of the graph, we don't know, is that actually a valley or is that actually a peak? Or have we just not zoomed out enough in our graph to see what's happening later on? Unlike absolute extrema, you can have multiple relative extrema, and they don't have to all be at the same height. It's just like a mountain range can have multiple peaks. You can have multiple relative extrema. It's okay also for you to have no relative extrema. You know, a straight line doesn't have a max or a min, or a relative max or a relative min. We never say infinity is a relative max or min. And I usually write my extrema as coordinate points, but you can also say there's a relative maximum of some number at x equals another number. Your y value is the actual extrema, the actual max or min, and the x value tells you where it's located. Let's do some examples. So determine the relative extrema. Okay, I have a relative maximum here and here. You can either give me the coordinate point, or you can say I have a relative maximum of 2 at x equals -3. And you can say I have a relative maximum of 3 at x equals 2. Then for relative min, I have a relative min of 0 at x equals -1, or write your coordinate point. So you can either write the coordinate point, or you say I have a relative maximum of this y value at this x value.